Watercolor paint behaves really differently from other types of paint. One of the things that happens is if you put wet watercolor paint next to other wet watercolor paint, it wants to bleed together. And sometimes that's a good thing, and sometimes that's not really what you want. Today we're going to learn a few different basic watercolor techniques that you can use in your own landscape painting. Some that you might choose to use for your foreground, your middle ground, your background, and your sky. Now, generally with your foreground, you want the most detail. And so you're not really going to want your paint to bleed. You're going to want it to stay exactly where you want it to stay. So we're going to learn a technique called wet on dry for that. In your middle ground, where you have things that are at a distance, you might want to intentionally let things bleed so that you're just creating the illusion of all those trees and hills and shrubs and all of that stuff, for example. So you're going to learn a technique called dibs and dabs for that. For my sky, I used wet paint with a little bit of salt to create this cool effect. You could also use that effect in trees and other things that are in your foreground. So the first technique I'm going to show you is wet on dry. But first, make sure that you're please using a watercolor brush. It's going to have a black or red handle, and if you're using enough water and paint, it's going to form a nice point for you because there's going to be a nice flow of water and paint on there. If it does this, it means you don't have enough paint and water. Your watercolor tray is only going to have the 3 primary colors plus black, white, and brown. That's because you're going to be mixing your colors. So make sure you have a water container and a paper towel to dry off your brush. You can either do your mixing in the mixing tray that comes with your watercolor set or in your own mixing tray. So here I have a wash of blue-gray paint that I've let dry. And now I'm going to show you painting wet paint on a dry surface. So I've mixed a green for us, and I'm painting a little bit of that green, and now I'm going to add a shade of that green. And as you can see, that paint isn't moving at all. That's because the color underneath is completely dry. So one of the keys to being a successful watercolor painter is really allowing your paint to dry, and that means being patient. The next technique I'm going to show you involves using lots of wet paint and then intentionally making that paint bleed. Remember, this is what I'm going to use in my middle ground where I want to show the idea of things off in the distance, like trees and shrubs or buildings. So I take that wet paint and then I dab other colors of paint onto it, and then I let them bleed. The next technique I'm going to show you also involves using lots of wet paint, and then I'm going to sprinkle some salt into that paint. And we have kosher salt, which is a bigger salt crystal. You're going to just pinch a little bit and sprinkle it on there. Again, this one works best when you have lots of wet paint and you don't want to touch it until the paint dries, but this is what I used in my sky. So let that paint dry and you'll end up with a cool effect.